Hello everybody, my name is Stefan Bauernschuster. I'm Professor of Public Economics at the University of Passau. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you Carlo Schwarz, today's speaker in our distinguished lecture series on digital platform ecosystems. So Carlo holds a PhD in economics from the Warwick University and is now assistant professor for Bocconi University. In his research, Carlo applies quasi-experimental techniques combined with machine learning to answer questions in the field of political economy, often with a particular focus on social media. Carlo finished his PhD just a year ago, so it's even more exciting to see that his first papers have already been published in the most prestigious journals of our profession, namely in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, the Journal of the European Economic Association, or the Economic Journal. Carlo's research has also created lots of media attention, as he showed that anti-refugee and anti-Islam posts on Facebook and Twitter causally fanned hate crime against minorities in the real world. I'm very much looking forward to Carlo's talk today, in which he will first give us an overview of his research on the impact of social media on hate crime, before he will then present to us new work on how Twitter shaped the presidential elections in the United States. So some housekeeping remarks before we start. We will now see a 45 minutes talk by Carlo. This talk is recorded and will be made available on the University of Passau's webpage and its YouTube channel. So if you ask a question during the talk, you might be recorded. That said, I ask you to, if possible, hold back your question until the end of the talk, unless it's super urgent. After the talk, we have another 45 minutes for questions and discussion. This part of today's session will not be recorded. So please feel free to actively participate. You can send your questions via the chat or the Q&A feature in Zoom. You can also directly raise your hand and we will then unmute you and you can ask your questions to Carlo directly. So right, now let's go. Thank you very much for being with us today. Carlo, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan, for the kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be here, as it's always great to see when basically as an academic that people are interested in one's research agenda. And I'm very much looking forward basically to sharing the insights of the research I and my co-authors have been doing over the last 5 years. And as Stefan already hinted at, I'm going to talk about several of my projects in the course of the next 45 minutes. I thought I'm going to start with basically a very brief overview or an idea why we are interested in social media and why people should care about the impact of social media. In case there's any doubt, this is an interesting field of research. Then I will talk about my 2 projects about hate crime in the connection to social media. One in Germany, looking at anti-refugee hate crime, and the second one in the United States, looking at Donald Trump's presidential one. And lastly, in the last 20 to 25 minutes of my presentation, I will then indeed look at my most recent research, where we look at the impact of Twitter on the last presidential elections. So to get started, I think given that I'm an economist, of course, economists really became interested in social media due to the enormous market valuations these companies achieved within basically a short amount of time in the short lifespan of basically they have existed. So these numbers are probably already slightly out of date since I looked them up a few months ago, but the market valuations of Facebook and Tencent, the Chinese company that operates the app WeChat, are beyond 600 billion US dollars, and as such, some of the most valuable companies in the world. And similarly, YouTube, which is obviously owned by Google on its own, is valued at around 300 billion. So these companies and these social media markets have been basically very, very much at the heart of these new digital economies. What then made social media basically interesting to me as a political economist, so someone who studies the interactions between like the market and market actors and like political outcomes, was really what I usually refer to as a sorcerer's apprentice type of problem. We have on the one hand these new technologies, basically that these valuable companies, and we want to understand this market, but on the other hand, people really began to worry about the way these companies are influencing basically the dissemination of information, the basically interaction between people, and political discourse. And when it comes to all of these factors, really people really were wondering whether social media platforms in this regard are a force for good, or whether basically they actually actively make things worse. And given that these platforms are very young, this was not very well understood. And even until today, I think we are not completely sure about the so-called total welfare effects of these social media companies. And in these projects, basically, I'm going to present today, we try to set some light on some of these effects of social media. So if you're familiar with basically economic research in media in general, of course you might know that there's already a lot has been written about like the impacts of radio on political outcomes, television, for example, in the US, looking at Fox News. And of course, a legitimate question is, are these social media platforms indeed different from media platforms? And in recent years, more and more people have argued indeed that our experience and our knowledge on basically these traditional media platforms does not easily translate to these new social media platforms. And the reason for that is, on the one hand, given the name, social media platforms are different very much because they are social. So it is possible for users to interact on these platforms and to create their own content. While in the past, basically, you could always scream at your television screen, but you, of course, were unlikely to get a reaction back. Now you can post basically your messages to 10,000 or hundreds of thousands of followers, which of course changes the game. And this is what, for example, Zurawskaya et al. In their review refer to as low entry barriers. Anyone basically now can become a media actor. And as long as he attracts enough people, he is able to influence basically what is said and broadcasted, not only online, but as we have seen in many examples, they can also influence public discourse outside of social media. And then a second strand of arguments then posits what also basically, in addition to this interactivity, social media platforms foster self-selection. And the argument here is not that, of course, even when television, you had the opportunity to choose your preferred television network. Basically in the US, liberals will watch MSNBC and conservatives will watch Fox News. But social media platforms now allow for far more finely grained self-selection, and now really allow for the formation of groups, for example, of conspiracy theorists like flat earthers. And within these so-called social media echo chambers, as Cass Sunstein refers to them, the deliberation, so the interactive exchange of such people with extreme viewpoints is supposed to lead to more and more extreme outcomes when these people basically become more and more convinced of their own political position, because they only exchange opinions with people who already share their opinion to begin with. And as such, people have begun to worry basically what these differences in social media platforms might do basically to actual real life outcomes. And as already stated in the introduction, we are going to look at 3 projects of mine, basically, which shed a bit of light on some of the outcomes we might be worried about. And the first case study in the paper called Fanning the Flames of Hate, Social Media and Hate Crime, me and my co-author Carsten Müller, who's currently still at Princeton University, but will switch to the National University of Singapore later this year. We became interested in the connection between anti-refugee posts on Facebook and anti-refugee incidents in Germany at the height of the refugee crisis. And this is very much also the time we started this project. And we are going to investigate the time period from the beginning of 2015 until the beginning of 2017. And the first hurdle we, of course, had to overcome is that we had to understand how much anti-refugee content is actually circulating on social media at specific points in time, and at which points do we see market spikes in anti-refugee sentiment on social media. So what we did in this project was we went to probably the most prominent anti-refugee Facebook page in Germany. So here you see a screenshot of the Facebook page of the Alternative for Germany. For those not familiar, basically the Alternative for Germany is a far-right party, the largest far-right party, undoubtedly probably the strongest anti-refugee voice at the time. And we were able to not only collect the post of the party with containing the full text and the interactions and the likes and shares of posts, but we were also able to extract the comments of users as well as their own post of users. And this is also what sets the Facebook page of the AfD apart from the Facebook pages of other parties in Germany, as the AfD was the only party that allowed their users to freely post messages on these boards. And the AfD at the time of writing also didn't outline any rules of conduct. And what this led to is that we were able to relatively easily identify anti-refugee comments on this page. And what we are doing in this project is we're now using the AfD's Facebook page as a proxy for the overall amount of anti-refugee sentiment that is circulating on a social media platform. So, and then just to get a first idea whether there could be any connection between anti-refugee incidents, which we base on data that were collected by the Amadeo Antonio Foundation, we just looked at the time series of the two variables in question. So in the following graph, you see in black the number of anti-refugee posts on the AfD page from the beginning of 2015 until the beginning of 2017. And in the gray dashed line, you see the number of anti-refugee incidents. And the first thing you see is that overall, basically our proxy for anti-refugee sentiment on social media seems to work reasonably well, as it coincides with many important events during the refugee crisis. So more importantly, basically Merkel's "We Can Do It" speech, then the assaults at the New Year's Eve night in Cologne, and then two terrorist attacks that were committed by refugees, each of which coincides with a huge spike in the anti-refugee volume on this Facebook page. And then in gray, we see at least, and we can also confirm that using some time series regression, there seems to be a strong time series correlation between the two variables. So in weeks where we observe more anti-refugee posts, we also observe more anti-refugee incidents. But based on this graph, of course, it's impossible to come to any conclusion whether the sentiment caused the attacks, whether the attacks caused the sentiment, or whether there's a third factor that could explain these time series correlations. And this was very much the challenge we tried to overcome in our paper. So what we did then is the following. We analyze in our paper now this movement of the anti-refugee sentiment over time. And we are going to analyze whether municipalities in Germany with the same amount of Facebook usage act differently conditional on whether, at times when one of these municipalities is suffering from an internet outage. So the idea here is similar if you wanted to run an experiment to identify the effect of social media. What you would do is you would get one group that uses social media and another group that basically is randomly cut off from the internet. And of course, you cannot do that really in real life, but internet outages, and we also look at Facebook outages, really get us as close to this experimental idea as basically as possible. And what we of course expect is if internet outages, basically, or if the sentiment on social media is indeed the cause of anti-refugee incidents, cutting people off from the sentiment should of course decrease the number of incidents. And this is very much indeed what we find. So these two graphs present the main result of the paper, just so maybe to explain it a bit. On the x-axis, on both sides, we find the number of anti-refugee posts. So this is the amount of sentiment, again, circulating on social media. And on the y-axis, we have the probability of an anti-refugee incident occurring in a given week in a given municipality. And the first thing we did is we split these municipalities in Germany by the number of AfD Facebook users per capita we identify in this municipality. And so the first prediction of a model of basically Facebook-caused incidents would suggest that the municipalities with high AfD Facebook usage should react more strongly than the municipalities with low Facebook usage. And this is very much what we see. So if you look at the black dots, the increase in anti-refugee incidents in municipalities with many AfD Facebook users is far stronger compared to the slope of this line in municipalities with low Facebook usage. So these municipalities should be less exposed to Facebook. The concern with this finding, of course, is that there could be other factors, and you might assume that these municipalities would react that strongly to Facebook sentiment, even in the absence of social media. And this is where the internet outages come in to really allow us to disentangle online factors from any other channel you might have in mind. And this, using these internet outages, is what gives us this very striking pattern. While in normal times, these municipalities react strongly to the amount of anti-refugee sentiment, during weeks where they suffer an internet outage, this relationship completely vanishes. And the behavior of these individuals is completely independent from the online sentiment. And we interpret this, in addition with several robustness checks I unfortunately don't have the time to cover here, as strong evidence that indeed this online sentiment is what is driving at least some of these incidents. Otherwise, an internet outage should not have any effect on anti-refugee incidents.
Carlo, may I just ask a question for understanding?
Of course.
Could you briefly say how long such an outage lasts on average?
Okay, basically, yeah, we have collected data that on hundreds of thousands of internet outages based on self-reports. We here only focus on longer lasting internet outages. So on the one hand, we restricted to outages that have to last at least 24 hours, and a significant fraction of the population needs to report an internet outage. So in total, we identify, I think, 335 municipality week pairs where internet outages have occurred that seems to have lasted for long. Basically, so we're really looking at longer lasting internet outages. And we have also validated these internet outages looking at the Facebook activity in these municipalities, really showing that this Facebook activity vanishes at the times we identify strong internet outages, and also looking at basically external sources and newspaper reports. So most of these outages are caused by either some kind of infrastructure damage where like the cable infrastructure gets harmed. So we are not considering any shorter outage. In the paper, then we also look at a lot of evidence on the micro level at the AfD page to show that, okay, the posts are indeed far more negative than what you see on normal news media compared, for example, to newspapers. But just to show you one graph I particularly found very interesting is where we analyzed an individual's behavior dependent on the amount of time he or she has spent on the AfD's Facebook page. So on the x-axis, again, we have the week since the first post of an individual on this Facebook page. And on the x-axis, we have the average number of anti-refugee posts that individual posts in any given week. And what this graph shows is that while in the beginning, in the first week of your post, the probability of posting an anti-refugee post is close to 0.05, but this over time increases to around 0.4, indicating that every bit more than 2 weeks you will post an anti-refugee post. And so what this indicates is that the more time you spend on these Facebook platforms of the far right, the more willing you also become to profess to anti-refugee sentiment. And This is very much in line with the story where these social media platforms over time are able to persuade people of more extreme viewpoints. This is also already the last result I want to talk about with regards to this project on Germany. And as already hinted at, we are now going to go to the other side of the pond and to the United States. And we're going to look at a completely different setting, a completely different social media network, a completely different minority group, and also a completely different identification strategy. And we are trying to understand whether there's indeed a connection between Twitter and anti-Muslim hate crime since the rise of Donald Trump's presidential run. So again, to start with a motivating figure, the reason why we decided to focus on anti-Muslim hate crime is if you look at the FBI hate crime statistics, what you observe is that with 2015, and that's the time period Donald Trump started his presidential campaign, we see a near doubling in the number of anti-Muslim incidents that occur in the US in every given year. And these spikes are the largest on record, with the exception of 2001, of course, where we basically, due to the September 11 attacks, we observe a huge spike in the number of anti-Muslim hate crime. And in case you are wondering, so the magnitude of these are indeed just 300 incidents, but this is mainly an artifact of basically that Muslims only make up less than 1% of the US population. So these 300 incidents mean that in every given year, 1 in 10,000 Muslims will become the victim of a hate crime if we assume that each of these hate crimes only has a single victim, which is, of course, also only a lower bound. And similarly to the project in Germany, then we again started motivated by a lot of newspaper reports that really a lot of people started blaming Donald Trump for these connections and his inflammatory tweets. And similar to the Germany project, we then looked at the connection between anti-Muslim tweets of Donald Trump and anti-Muslim hate crime in the US. So this is again shown in this graph. Donald Trump's tweets in orange, the anti-Muslim hate crime again as a dashed line in blue. And here compared to Germany, I hope you agree, the connection seems to be even stronger. I think there seems to be an even stronger alignment of the spikes. So this time series correlation, if anything, is the connection seems to be even more apparent. But of course, we suffer the same concerns as in the Germany project. So what we do in our analysis is here, or basically what we try to establish is that Donald Trump, through his tweets, spread anti-Muslim sentiment through Twitter, and the people who got exposed to the sentiment, and basically these are people, of course, at the fringes of the political spectrum, some people and some potential perpetrators were then pushed over the edge to commit violent acts against Muslims in the United States. And we face here two main sources of indigeneity. The first one is, of course, that Donald Trump's tweets, even though some people say they are as good as random, of course, they seem to be strategically timed. So you might be concerned that he's tweeting about Muslims at times where terror attacks occur. We address this in the paper by proposing an instrument that is shifting the topics of the tweets around, which is based on his presidential schedule. And therefore, we exploit the fact that the presidential schedule is in large part predetermined, and therefore should help us to basically get around such concerns of endogeneity. And then the second source of indigeneity is, of course, who is exposed to Twitter in the United States, and selection into Twitter is, again, very much endogenous. And to get around these other concerns, we are proposing a novel instrument for county-level Twitter usage in the US, which is based on the 2007 South by Southwest Festival, which is an important event in the early stage adoption of Twitter. And we are exploiting that this festival, even until today, left an imprint on social media usage. And we are then exploiting this variation to identify the causal impact of Twitter Unfortunately, due to basically the time limitation, I will not have time basically to introduce you to these instruments in this case. I will just show you basically our basically ordinary least squared estimates. In case you are interested, of course, in these instruments, you can either read the paper, but as we are using the same instrument in our election paper, so the third project I will be discussing today, there I will go into deeper detail, and then you hopefully will also understand how this festival helps us to disentangle the effect from Twitter from other observable characteristics. So, to get started and to show you basically the first graph we produced, and here again the idea was, if Twitter is responsible for the spread of anti-Muslim sentiment in the US, we would expect this increase in hate crime I showed you on the first slide of this project to be concentrated in counties with more Twitter usage. And this is what this event study graph shows you. While counties with many Twitter users followed similar trends before Donald Trump's presidential run, at the time of Donald Trump's presidential run, we now see this marked increase in anti-Muslim hate crime in these counties, very much in line with the story where the sentiment is spreading through Twitter. And now you have to take my word for it that the relationship also holds when we look at Twitter usage using our instrument. If anything, this relationship appears to be slightly stronger, as you would expect downward biases when just using Twitter usage as the independent variable. And then secondly, we looked at Donald Trump's Twitter activity. And on the one hand, we confirmed what we've already seen in the time series plot. We observe a spike in anti-Muslim incidents on the day after Donald Trump's anti-Muslim tweets. But given the granularity of our data, we can in fact do even better. And what this graph is showing you, basically, we are now analyzing the effect or like the change in anti-Muslim hate crimes in counties with high Twitter usage around Donald Trump's anti-Muslim tweets. And what we observe is basically on the day after, we now observe really an increase, which is statistically significant in the number of incidents in counties with many Twitter users, where we take any baseline differences and any general changes in the number of hate crimes in the US out of our regression, in line basically again with our strategy. And of course, again, these finding holds when we use our instrument. What I then, as a last piece of evidence, also want to show you, because even so purely descriptive, I found stunning when we produced this graph for the first time. Because what we did is we collected all tweets in the US for our observation period that contain the hashtag Stop Islam and Ban Islam. So clearly anti-Muslim hashtags or anti-Islamic hashtags. And now we checked how many of these tweets come from people that follow Donald Trump on Twitter. And what we find is this strong pattern that of the close to or over 600,000 tweets that contain the hashtag Stop Islam, nearly 80% come from people that follow Donald Trump on Twitter. And similarly, the same pattern is the same, even so it's a longer level for the hashtag Ban Islam. So what this tells us is that of the people who harbor anti-Muslim sentiments on Twitter, nearly all of them somehow selected into following Donald Trump and thereby receiving his Twitter messages. And this then, of course, makes it plausible that such basically messages then also reach the very people who might be willing then in there to commit acts of violence or also basically other forms of hate crime against Muslim minorities in the United States. Of course, basically it is in the end a 100-page paper. I will not have time to cover all the results, but just to give you a brief overview of the main identification strategies and the main ideas behind this analysis. Of course, I'm very happy to talk more about our findings and our analysis in the Q&A session at the end. So which now brings us to the third project I want to talk about, which is now our most recent work on the effect of social media on elections, again, in the same setting in the United States. In this project, we also partnered with Thomas Fujiwara, who is associate professor at Princeton University. And here again, I think it's fair to say in 2016, even so, I've been doing research on social media and also on hate crime. It came as a surprise to many people that Donald Trump was indeed able to win the presidency of the United States. And in the immediate aftermath of his electoral triumph, we saw a lot of stories about how, on the one hand, basically the Russian bots on Twitter were able to convince people that you shouldn't vote for Hillary Clinton. So basically forcing people to abstain from voting for the Democrats. And on the other hand, how Trump's tweets have been such an effective tool of advertisement and basically political genius to convince basically and persuade voters to vote for him. Again, basically, the reason why we started this project was, despite all these news stories, there until basically our project, there has been hardly any convincing empirical evidence that social media can have any electoral effect. And this is a gap we are trying to fill with our project. So to provide you basically an overview of what we are doing in this project and our main findings, I will then go over later throughout this presentation. So again, as already hinted at, we are using this quasi-experimental shock based on the 2007 South by Southwest Festival to create variation in Twitter usage that we argue is unrelated to observable characteristics. And we are then using this shock to the Twitter usage at the county level to investigate whether counties with more Twitter users have voted differently from counties with fewer Twitter users. And what we find is that, if anything, higher Twitter usage or Twitter exposure decreases the Republican vote share in the 2016 and 2020 presidential election. So if anything, our findings suggest that Donald Trump won despite of Twitter in 2016 and might have lost because of Twitter in 2020 and not the other way around. And here we have very consistent findings, whether we look at results at the county level or at individual level data in basically large nationwide surveys in the US. Very interestingly, we find no effect for any earlier election. So whether the 2008 or 2012 election, basically where people also have suggested some role of social media, in these elections, we find always a zero result. And we also find a zero result for all House and Senate elections, even in 2016, 2018, and 2020. So what this tells us is that people on the same day voted against Donald Trump, but on a different ballot than didn't vote against the Republican Party more general. And this is something we're going to investigate further in our paper. Then, consistent with models of so-called Bayesian persuasion, these effects seem to be driven by undecided voters, or what we identify as swing counties, so counties that don't have a consistent voting record. And lastly, we have also collected, of course, close to 1 billion tweets from Twitter, which then allow us to document the indeed pro-democratic backlash against Donald Trump or basically the Republican Party more general on Twitter. So this is what we are doing. And now basically, in the interest of time, I think I will skip over the related literature. I think some of these papers we have seen by now on the impact of social media on xenophobia, but there's also now a growing literature on the impact of social media on protest movements. And of course, there has been a lot of work done on polarization and fake news on social media. And we have an existing literature on basically the effects of traditional media platforms and the internet in more general. But I think it's more interesting basically to get to the data and our identification strategy. So unsurprisingly, if you want to understand Twitter usage and basically the impact on vote shares, you need measures for either variable. So we have basically Republican vote share data at the county level, which are from the canonical source, David Leib's election atlas. And we have a Twitter usage measure per capita, which is based on the 4 million geolocated user profiles in the US, which were collected by Kinder and Kurlander et al. In 2015. And so this is more or less like a 7% snapshot of the US Twitter population we are using here to analyze the geography of Twitter usage. And the advantage of this measure is that we have individual level data we really can put to use to analyze long-term adoption effects and also do comparison of Twitter users at the county level, which would be impossible if we use other Twitter usage measures. So this brings us then to our identification strategy and the South by Southwest Festival. So I presume basically as similar to me, you had never heard of the South by Southwest Festival, but the South by Southwest Festival is a music festival and conference that takes place every year since basically since many decades in Austin, Texas. And what sets the 2007 festival apart is that Twitter, 1 year after launch, held basically an event there to basically get people to sign up for the platform. So what they did is they put screens into the hallways that showed tweets about the festival, and they allowed users to sign up for Twitter by simply sending an SMS to a predefined phone number. And this event basically turned out to be extremely successful. So here we have an article from The Guardian of the time where they write about how the Twitter crowd goes bananas at South by Southwest. But it is also, this festival is also noted if you look at the Wikipedia article about the festival, and we even have quotes from the founders of Twitter that really this festival put Twitter on a differential growth path compared to the pre-period. As always in research, anecdotal evidence is nice, but we also wanted to put some data basically to work to prove this impact of the South by Southwest Festival. So what we have done is we collected the tweets from the time of the festival mentioning the festival, and we have created a proxy of overall English-speaking Twitter activity based on the 100 most common English words. And this is what is shown in this graph. So in blue, you see basically the spike of South by Southwest tweets around the festival, but more interestingly, the dashed red line, which shows the overall growth of Twitter activity throughout the weeks leading up to the festival. So Twitter was already growing before, as you would expect with a new platform. But with the onset of the festival, we now see this clear uptick in the speed of overall Twitter activity. And in fact, the month-to-month growth rate more than quadrupled with the South by Southwest Festival. And that's also in line basically what is talked about in basically the sources from this time. What we are now exploiting in our regression strategy is the fact that this shock to the South by Southwest was localized in specific counties in the US, and not all counties in the US were equally exposed to this shock. And we argue that the counties that were more exposed to the shock are the counties where we observe new people joining as a result of the festival. And this is basically our regression strategy here. So our outcome variable at the county level, Y is either going to be county level vote shares, county basically changes in vote shares, or also outcomes of survey responses. And we will always request that on our measure of Twitter usage. And in the first stage of our instrumental variable estimate, we are basically going to instrument for Twitter users at the county level with the number of South by Southwest followers in a county that joined in March 2007. So this is a group of people we argue was plausibly induced by the festival to join Twitter. And therefore, this variable measures how many additional Twitter users a county received as a result of the festival. So this is basically the shock exposure. A concern you, of course, might have is that these people, of course, come from very specific counties in the US. And even so, we have a large vector of control variables, which is called XC in these regressions. We might not be able to take all unobservable factors into account in our IV strategy. But to address such concerns that basically any of our findings is driven by the selection of people into the South by Southwest Festival, what we are doing is we are controlling for the number of South by Southwest followers in a county that already joined before the festival, which allows us basically to address most of these concerns. So to convince you first that our instrument, or basically that the South by Southwest shock was indeed localized to the home counties of the South by Southwest adopters, we are breaking our measure of overall Twitter activity in the US, which you have seen in the previous figure, down to the county level. And now we are checking, do we see an uptick in Twitter activity or a disproportionate uptick in Twitter activity in the counties with basically new followers joining as a result of the South by Southwest Festival? And as this graph confirms, these counties had similar growth rates of Twitter before the festival, but now with the festival, we observe this uptick in Twitter activity in line with our story. And we don't only have this short-term evidence basically around the weeks of the festival, we can also look at Twitter usage over time since the festival. And what we observe is this S-shaped technology adoption curve, indeed indicating that as a result of the festival, we see this long-term uptick in Twitter usage in these counties that persists until today. And this is then very much the difference in Twitter usage we are going to exploit with our instrumental variation. So, but to get back to the concern about omitted variables or the selection of these South by Southwest users. So what we have to defend here is that there's not basically there's not another variable that could affect election outcomes which correlates with the number of South by Southwest followers in a county. And this is a very valid concern, as the South by Southwest basically followers and South by Southwest attendees are by no means a representative cross-section of the US population. But what we do really to address this concern is the following. I already mentioned that we have the home counties of the South by Southwest followers who joined before the festival. And the only thing that basically both of these counties have people in them that are interested in the South by Southwest Festival. And both sets of these counties have early stage basically Twitter users. And we can show indeed that these two sets of counties are almost identical when it comes to observable characteristics. But what sets them apart is that only this top set of counties received an additional inflow of users as a result of the festival, while this other set of counties remained at the level of Twitter users they would have had even an absence of the South by Southwest Festival. And as a result, we find that even until today in these counties, we observe higher level of Twitter usage, while in this other set of counties where people joined before the festival, these county Twitter usage is perfectly explained by the observable characteristics we are controlling for. So here, this just shows you the balancedness table, where we show that indeed the counties with people joining in March and the pre-period are identical based on observable characteristics. Basically, I could talk more about that, but I think this is just to convince you that indeed these counties appear based on observable characteristics very similar. But what we argue now, if there were an omitted variable that is driving any election result in basically with the exception of Twitter usage, such an omitted variable should also affect these counties in the pre-period. And we should therefore also see electoral effects for the number of followers basically we observe in the pre-period. But as I will show you consistently throughout the paper, the coefficient for this pre-period is always statistically insignificant and often even goes in the opposite direction, indicating that indeed the basic existence of such an omitted variable at least is unlikely. So to be completely transparent for the identification experts among the audience, an omitted variable basically that is biasing our results would need to be correlated with our instrument, the number of South by Southwest followers, our outcome variable, but at the same time, it would need to be uncorrelated with the number of followers joining before, this basically the close to 50 observable characteristics we are including in our regressions as controls, as we find no differences between these two groups. And given that we find nothing for earlier presidential elections and also nothing for elections in how, when it comes to House and Senate elections, such an unobservable anti-Republican bias would also need to be uncorrelated with these election outcomes. And we argue that the existence of such an omitted variable seems unlikely, and that we are indeed therefore picking up the effect of Twitter usage and not the effect of any omitted variable. And this is very much the same argument we are also using in the previous project to argue for a causal impact of Twitter usage on hate crimes in the United States. So now, after this slightly lengthy introduction to our instrument, but I think it's helpful to explain it in detail, so we can now go more briefly over the actual results. So here, this graph just shows you the relationship between the number of South by Southwest followers in a county in 2007 and Twitter usage as of today. Oh, I'm sorry, and we indeed see this strong positive correlation, and in this regression table, we confirm that this relationship also persists when we include all of our control variables. And as indicated, the effect for the pre-period is always statistically insignificant and also by an order of magnitude smaller than our main estimate here. And we can then take this first stage and look at the electoral outcomes in the second stage. So again, to be completely transparent, we report here a bin scatter plot about for the reduced form relationship of our instrument and the Republican vote share. And you, I think, very easily, all you can see here, this negative relationship between the South by Southwest following and the Republican vote share. And this is then, of course, confirmed using our reduced form and two-stage least squares estimates. So in the interest of time, just to focus on one column here, column 5 tells us that a doubling in the amount of Twitter usage is associated with a 2% reduction of the Republican vote share in the 2016 presidential election. And as already hinted at, the coefficient for the pre-period is, if anything, positive, but also far from any statistical significance here. What is nice, so we started this project where we only had data for the 2016 presidential election, but now since last November, we had another data point. So we reproduced all our findings, not changing any of our specification for the 2020 presidential election. And as you can see here in column 10, these estimates are indeed very similar to what we are observing in the 2016 presidential election, suggesting that indeed this effect is very much present in the other election. And if anything, these estimates only differ by the third decimal digit. Which then brings us to the question of, is this now just an effect that basically occurs now in 2016 or 2020, or do we see anything for earlier elections? So here on the one hand, we have a placebo estimate for the 2000 to 2004 change in the vote share. We also reported in levels in the paper. So this is an election that took place before the launch of Twitter. And then we have estimates for the change from 2000 to 2008 and 2000 to 2012, which potentially could have been affected by Twitter usage. But what we find is that all of these three coefficients are statistically insignificant, and also in comparison magnitude far smaller than anything what we observe for 2016, indicating that in earlier presidential elections, Twitter does not seem to have played a role. So given this interesting finding, of course, we then started thinking about why could it be that we are indeed observing a differential effect for these later presidential elections and not for these earlier presidential elections? And the first thing we started with is to look at who is actually changing his vote in the 2016 presidential election. And so what we did is we went to the so-called cooperative congressional election study, which is one of the largest election surveys done in the United States. And we looked at a variable in particular, which where people were asked whether they voted for Donald Trump or for Hillary Clinton. And now we basically, first we confirmed, okay, also in this study, people living in counties with higher Twitter usage appear to be less likely to vote for Donald Trump. But more importantly, we can split the respondents based on their party affiliation or party identification. And as you observe, these changes in vote shares are predominantly driven by independent and moderate Republican voters, maybe also slightly by moderate Democrats, while we find nothing for strong Democrats and strong Republicans. So this indicates that indeed the people, as you might expect, with weak political attitudes that are the ones that can be persuaded to vote against Donald Trump by exposure to the Twitter social media network and the content therein. But this still leaves us with a question, why just an effect in 2016 and 2020? And the three potential explanations we came up with are the following. First, it could be an effect of basically the growth of the Twitter network. So the user number of Twitter has tremendously increased since 2012. So is it just driven by a larger number of users that these effects only become visible now? Secondly, it could be a content effect. So Twitter could have shifted to the left more general and thereby become more persuasive or more harmful to the Republican Party. And lastly, we investigated a so-called, what we call a Trump effect. So that this is indeed an effect specific to Trump and his rhetoric on Twitter, which provoked a backlash by the majority of left-leaning people on the social media platform. And then this backlash was what convinced these moderate voters not to vote for Donald Trump. And overall, basically, just to making a long story short, we argue that the last story seems to be the most plausible one, mainly for the reason that, as also mentioned previously, when we look at congressional elections, so this figure shows you congressional elections since 2000, in particular House elections. We also have similar results for Senate elections. We never find any negative impact of Twitter. If anything, all of these coefficients are positive. And we don't find any effect, neither in 2016, nor in 2018, nor 2020. So if you believe that it's just a user number effect or an effect driven by more left-leaning content, such an effect should also probably show up in these elections. But given the absence of the effect here, it really seems to be something specific to Trump. And we confirm this even further by looking even within the Republican primary. So where we are now comparing Trump to the other Republican competitors. And in particular interest here, of course, the likely Republican voters. So this is based on the Gallup Daily Tracker. And what we find is indeed that while also here, higher Twitter exposure seems to be associated with lower votes for Donald Trump and also slightly for Ted Cruz, probably the most right-wing candidates in the Republican field, we find no effect for Marco Rubio and for John Kasich, the most moderate Republican. If anything, these effects seem to be even slightly positive. And on the other side of the political aisle, Hillary Clinton seems to gain votes in counties with higher Twitter usage. So all in all, even this basically points towards a very Trump-specific effect. And the last thing we have then done is to actually turn to Twitter-level microdata. And so we have downloaded close to 1 billion tweets from the 2012, 2016, and 2020 presidential election. And now in this figure, we are plotting the number of likes basically 4 tweets about the Republican presidential candidate. So that in 2012, this is Mitt Romney, in 2016 and 2020, Donald Trump. And on the one hand, you see the enormous growth of Twitter activity over the time horizon. But what is more important is that the slant of this Twitter content is indeed predominantly democratic. So what we have done here is we have classified the users based on their Twitter network. And as you see, 52% of the tweets in 2016 and 46% of the tweets in 2020 come from users that we classify as Democrats, and only 27% of tweets come from Republicans. That means in the Twitter network, if you are basically just would see tweets at random, you would be twice as likely to see an anti-Trump tweet than a tweet basically that agrees with him. And this is very much in line with the story where we see like these pro-democratic backlash against Trump's rhetoric on Twitter. We, of course, also done this analysis for the Democratic presidential candidates. And here we can show that indeed the attention paid to Democratic presidential candidates on Twitter is significantly lower. In fact, Trump attracted 5 times as many tweets as Hillary Clinton and still 3 times as many tweets as Joe Biden. So also here we see that Trump is clearly an outlier in this regard. So to briefly conclude and basically to sum up the findings here. So what we argue, and I hope I was able to convince you in the last 20 minutes, is that social media really likely increased the Republican vote share in these both elections, and that this effect works through changing the opinions of these moderate voters. And very interestingly, given that we don't have any effect for these earlier elections and for Senate and House elections in the same year, we argue that this seems to be most consistent with the never Trump effect and not something that is basically baked into the Twitter network. So what is interesting then about this project is, on the one hand, as already stated in the beginning, it seems like Trump won in 2016 despite Twitter, not because of it, debunking like a prominent left-wing talking point about the interference of Russian bots, or at least basically finding no support for such an argument. And on the other hand, what is important is also that the Republican talking point of Twitter as a clearly biased and left-leaning network also doesn't seem to be borne out, as we do not find any election effect in any election Donald Trump is not running in. So, of course, basically, we have to wait another 4 years to see whether these results would produce in the 2024 election. But so far, our findings really suggest that it was indeed Donald Trump who harmed his electoral chances just through his basically inflammatory Twitter rhetoric. So with this, I have reached the end of my presentation. I hope I didn't go too much over time. And I'm very much looking forward to the general discussion, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.